You're listening to part 1 of a Barefoot Lawyer Reports on China presentation by Yashue Cao, director of the documentary The Defenders, 20 Years of Human Rights Lawyers in China. To watch the documentary, please check the link in the description.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this occasion, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and thank you for coming. 11 years ago, when I started the ChinaChange.org website, I went through an intense learning period. At the time, I had lived in the US for 20 years already. Among the first things I read was the story of a human rights lawyer whose name is Gao Zhisheng, and whose sculpture is in your law school. In an article titled Dark Night, Dark Hood Kidnapped to a Dark Underworld, he detailed how secret police snatched him away and the horrific torture he was subjected to. It was a surreal reading for me, even though I grew up a communist China and had lived long enough to know a thing or two about its atrocities. I can still recall that sensation of being catapulted into a realm that I didn't know existed. Then I was hit by a ban of guilt. I was ashamed of my blight, ignorance, and moral failure. Gao Zhisheng's essay was written in 2007. On my visits during those years, I saw gleaming new skyscrapers going up and highways, bustling construction sites. For the 2008 Olympics, I enjoyed friends and family, fine food, excursions to remote Great Wall sites, but I had no idea that somewhere in the basement, a brave lawyer was being beaten, urinated on, his genitals being pricked by toothpicks, and so on, for speaking up against the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. He is a Christian defending the religious freedom of a Buddhist group. Rights defense lawyers emerged in China in the early 2000s. They are the first generation of the human rights lawyers. Gao Zhisheng is one of them. They are a small band of lawyers who have taken it on to themselves to defend dissidents, journalists, believers, private entrepreneurs, farmers whose home and land had been forcefully expropriated to make way for government-backed developers, victims of poisoned infant milk powder, women's rights, workers' rights, victims of a workplace and other forms of discrimination, and so on. They fought, often for years on end, with little pay, to correct wrongful corrections. In some cases, they have even defended Communist Party officials who found themselves in desperate need for due process. It's no wonder that the communist regime does not like them. Punish has followed on the heels of these lawyers, as in the case of Gao Zhisheng and many others in many forms. But before we get to that, I think a brief orientation regarding the Chinese lawyers' unique position in China's judicial system is called for, because it's like nowhere else, in no other societies. Do you know that from 1949, when the communists took power, up to 1979, China didn't have a criminal code? For 30 years, China didn't have a criminal code. The only civil law was marriage law. No laws, basically. But there was a people's court in every town and city, and the court judgment would list the offense and the sentence without setting the law. Periodically, the court would post its judgments printed on large posts on the bulletin board in the town square. The one receiving the death sentence had a red cross over their names. One of my childhood memories, when I was 6, 7, 8, was stopping by the bulletin on my way home from school, reading court announcement with a frozen morbidness. I don't know why I did that. Each verdict had only 2 or 3 lines, crime and punishment. That was all. To its credit, the communist regime did attempt to draft and pass a criminal code in those decades, but the draft never passed muster under the party's ideology. For example, the idea of innocent until proven guilty was deemed capitalist legal theory, and therefore objectionable. The idea that certain elements must be established beyond a reasonable doubt for an act to be a crime was held to be regressive. So despite going through no less than 33 drafts prior to 1979, China didn't manage to promulgate a criminal code until 1979, after Mao Zedong's death, when the country embarked on reform and opening up. So for the first 30 years of this regime, it had the police, known as public security. For a few years at the beginning, it established a prosecution system, but the regime could find no use for it between public security and the courts. As for lawyers, there was no place for them anywhere in that system. However, during Mao Zedong's era, we all know that a massive number of people were penalized through the Chinese court system. Still more were penalized without even a semblance of a verdict. Chairman Mao was the law. The party was the law. The party dictates crime and punishment, and the court was merely a functionary of the party, an auxiliary organ that did a little more than producing, posting, and filing away verdicts. As China began reform and the opening up in 1978, it quickly set up a proper-looking judicial system. It reinstated the prosecution system to supposedly supervise trials and litigations. It went through a frantic period of lawmaking through its National Congress of People's Representatives. The Ministry of Justice was created for the first time. What was missing? Lawyers. Lawyers were missing. So the party said, let there be lawyers. The earliest lawyers in the 1980s were government employees, and their office was called Legal Advisory Office, subordinate to the Justice Department. There were about 200 such lawyers in 1980. Can you imagine that? 200. Mainly in Beijing and a handful of other major cities. The Chinese public first saw lawyers on TV during the trial of the Gang of Four in 1980. The Four and some of their underlings were accused of perpetrating atrocities during the Cultural Revolution. Among other features of the trial, which I will speak briefly about later, I want to point out that 18 lawyers were appointed by the state to defend the accused. But as Zhang Sizhi, leader of the defense team, wrote years later, quote, when the defense team was put together, the Ministry of Justice set rules for us. 1, we're prohibited to argue against the predetermined criminal charges. 2, we were not allowed to question the facts put together by the government, end quote. He went on to say that I did what I was told to do and played the role of an obedient tool. In the years since, the lawyer profession in China has gone through a lot of changes and see tremendous growth. By the mid-90s, lawyers ceased to be government employees and became independent. Law firms popped up everywhere. And over the past 4 decades, the number of lawyers increased from 200 to 650,000 and counting by today. But one thing has remained the same. The regime has never trusted lawyers. It has never meant to let lawyers to become a player equal to the 3 other arms of the party-controlled judiciary, namely the police, the prosecutors, and the court. Justice bureaus at all levels conduct an annual review of law firms and the lawyers to make sure lawyers are toeing the line. Lawyers' associations are controlled by the authorities. Laws and regulations have grown more and more stringent to limit lawyers' legitimate work and the expression about the judicial abuses they experience. In recent years, law firms have been required to host the Communist Party branch. In other words, there are multiple leashes on lawyers as they do their work. A lawyer named Si Weijiang once described it in this way. He said, China's judicial system is like 3 people playing mahjong: the police, the prosecution, and the court. They need a 4th player to play, so the defense lawyer is called in. The lawyer is only allowed to dispense tiles. The other 3 parties need to win, but the lawyer is not allowed to win. If he dared to defy this understanding and actually wins, the 3 other players would flip the table over and beat the lawyer to the ground. That's not what I said. That's a lawyer's very, very respected lawyer in China said, in Shanghai.
The Catholic University of America's Center for Human Rights has published a documentary on the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The documentary features world-class human rights experts, from former State Department officials to ambassadors and human rights activists. It can be found on our website at humanrights.catholic.edu.